Hello, Civics. Today, you're going to be watching the notes for the first time instead of giving them in class. What we're going to be doing today is going to be covering the three branches of government, looking at what each one does specifically, and then looking at how they check each other to make sure not one becomes too powerful. Yesterday, we looked at the principles of the Constitution and kind of our government, talked about the separation of powers, federalism, uh, limited government, popular sovereignty. Today, we're going to really focus on the separation of powers. Um, so, we're going to start with the executive branch. So, as we kind of go along, make sure you're taking notes, make sure you're filling out your learning target guide. If you need to pause it, pause it. Awesome. Like I said, we're going to start with the executive branch today. So, the executive branch includes the president, vice president, and cabinet. What their role is to enforce the laws. So, we're going to see, remember from last unit, we talked about the different roles of each branch. Executive enforces, legislate creates, judicial interprets. Today we're going to be focusing first on the executive branch, and they enforce the laws. So these are some of the roles of the executive branch that are in the Constitution that kind of tell us what the branch is supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. The executive branch is outlined in Article 2 of the Constitution. And these are some of the things that are listed in it and what the executive branch is supposed to do. One, they can sign or veto laws. So the president's role is to sign laws into the law. So if something gets passed through Congress, the president's role is to sign it into law. Or the president can also veto it. So say, nope, I'm not going to sign this, and send it back to Congress. And we'll talk about what that process looks like later when we talk about the legislative branch. But the president's role is to sign or veto laws. They are to act as the commander-in-chief of the military, of the armed forces. Our founders wanted our commander-in-chief to be not someone in the military, to kind of have a check on the military itself. They wanted to have them primarily as a citizen, non-military. Obviously, if a president is prior military, they have that experience. But what the founders wanted is to have someone in charge of the military that's not a part of it and outside of it, so to kind of keep them in check. The executive branch also creates and executes treaties. So if there's a treaty between a nation, like we see NATO or the USMCA, the president's role is to create and execute these treaties in what they are, how they work. Congress has to approve them. We'll talk about that later. But the president's role is to create these treaties. The president's role is also to act as the head of state. So they are our kind of representative of our country, as like the Queen would be for England. The president is our head of state. They are the person who is in charge of, or kind of the person that people look at our country as our leader. So they're kind of our leader of our country. So these are some of the main executive branch functions. Remember, the executive branch enforces the laws. Now we're going to move on to the legislative branch. The legislative branch, which includes the House and the Senate, they create the laws. So the president signs them into law, but the legislative branch are the ones who actually creates the laws. So presidents do not create laws. The roles of the legislative branch, they create and pass laws. This is their main function. There's a process to creating the laws, how they're introduced to the House or the Senate. They have to pass by getting the majority of the votes in the House and the Senate. Then after both houses, the House and the Senate decide, yes, we want to pass this, then it gets passed to the president. And the president then has to say, okay, do I sign this or not? And that is the main rule of the legislature. Remember, this is Article 1. The founders really focused on this article because they believed it to be the most important, the legislative branch to be kind of the most powerful and the most important role or branch of the government. And that's why they made it them the biggest representatives of the people, because they wanted, remember the idea of limited government, popular sovereignty, that they wanted the government to be full of people, citizens of the country, not people who are just there for control. Number 2, they create amendments to the Constitution. We talked about this last unit about how to create change. Most of the process of creating these amendments are done through Congress first. We see them create the amendments, getting them passed, and then they get sent to the state. This is one role of the legislative branch. Another one is to raise and support an army. So this is going to be in charge of creating an army, raising it, creating the laws and things around the military. The executive branch are the ones who kind of carry out these. And we have the executive branch have the commander-in-chief rule. But the raising and supporting an army, funding it, are all going to come through the legislative branch. They are to declare war. This is a rule that Congress has in our government. The president does not declare war, as commonly kind of thought. Congress has to approve and declare the war. This is so not one person can bring us into a war. It has to be Congress, our representatives, declaring it. So that's going to be a big kind of a role of the legislative branch to actually declare war. And then 5, this is probably the most powerful part of the legislative branch over the others. They are in charge of creating taxes and the spending. So they have the power of the purse, is what we call it. If the executive branch wants to do something, they have to get funding from Congress. If anything needs funding, it has to come through Congress. This is going to be one of their powers that they have. That's going to be really important to the other branches, as well as in our government itself, because they have that power of the purse. They have the money on their side. They have the ability to decide if they're going to raise taxes, lessen taxes, increase government spending, decrease spending. What they're spending the money on is going to be a big role for the legislative branch. In the Constitution, there is something called the Elastic Clause, otherwise known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. This allows Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out their enumerated powers. Remember, we talked about enumerated powers versus reserved powers yesterday, how in federalism, the states have different powers in the federal government or the national government, and the Constitution is saying what each role is. However, the Constitution isn't the most clear. So they also provided in the Constitution this elastic clause that allows Congress to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out their powers. This is going to be the biggest kind of form of contention or time of debate for a lot of the people in Congress, because whether or not is it necessary and proper, what kind of goes into the realm of that, is going to be kind of a majoring factor. One example of this is one of the concurrent powers or the federal powers is to have a postal system. So like the USPS, the United States Postal Service, one of the necessary and proper clauses that they found was to create roads in order for the Postal Service to enact their business. They needed roads to that, so they gave the federal government the power to create interstates in these different roads that go between states. They use the elastic clause in order to gain that power, because it's not directly in the Constitution for the federal government to do, but in order to carry out their other enumerated powers, like creating a postal service, they needed to create roads in order to do that. So that's kind of how the elastic clause has been used. Next, we're going to look at the judicial branch. Judicial branch is the Supreme Court or any court system in the United States. The Supreme Court is the highest court of the land. This judicial branch's role is to interpret the laws. So the roles of the judicial branch are resolving disputes over federal law. So figuring out remember the different types of laws we looked at yesterday with the supremacy clause. There was Constitution, federal law, state law, things like that. Federal law kind of trumps all. So they are to resolve disputes over the federal law. They also resolve disputes between states. So if there's some sort of issue between each state, they are to figure out what the issue is. Because obviously, if it is like Minnesota versus Iowa, you don't want to have that case solved or adjudicated in Minnesota because there'll be some bias. So the United States Supreme Court would take that case. They act as the head of the U.S. court system. So through the Court of Appeals, through everything, if the court keeps getting a case that is very complicated or has a lot of attention to it that needs to be decided, it'll oftentimes go all the way up through the system and up to the Supreme Court, which will then ultimately rule on the case. And again, Supreme Court picks which cases they hear. So not all cases will be heard, and depends on who's on the court, depends on which cases they'll hear. So it's kind of an important position to be in as the Supreme Court. And again, the person who nominates people on there is the president, and then the Senate has to confirm them. So we're going to look at the checks and balances now. So we just looked at the three different branches, kind of their roles, and kind of what each of them is supposed to do. We talked a lot about yesterday about the separation of powers, kind of how that leads to these checks and balances on our government, to make sure not each one of them becomes too powerful. So what checks and balances does, it gives each branch of the government the ability to check or limit the other two branches. So they want to make sure that each branch is kind of checking on each other to make sure not one of them is becoming too strong. So this is going to be kind of a key principle of our Constitution and of our government. So an example of the executive branch can check the power of the other branches are the president can veto laws passed by the legislative branch. Those vetoes get sent back to the legislative branch, and then they have to figure out how to change it, or they can override the veto, which is one of their checks over the executive branch. But this is going to be the major check on the legislative branch that the executive has. And for the judicial branch, they're the ones who are appointing the justices to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court might rule on a case, and their check is going to be from the executive branch, that the executive branch is the one who nominates those justices. So we just saw President Trump nominate Amy Coney Barrett after Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. We've seen this being a very big form of debate on why people want a certain president to be elected in order to get their justices they like on the Supreme Court. All right, so now we're going to look at the legislative branch. What checks do they have on the other two? So we saw the executive checking the legislative and the judicial. Now, what does the legislative do? For the executive and the judicial, actually, they can impeach public officials. So if they believe someone is out of line or doing something that they deem as impeachable, and what the Constitution says that is gross misdemeanors or felonies or treason. So if they believe there is some sort of wrongdoing there, that House can impeach the president, then the Senate has to confirm it. And we just saw President Trump 2 years ago become impeached. Actually, that was his last year. Become impeached. He was not removed. He was the third president to become impeached. But this is a way for the legislative branch to check a sitting president or a judicial nominee who is out of line. They can also override the presidential vetoes that they can override the presidential vetoes that the executive branch holds. So the president says, I'm not signing that. It gets sent back to the Congress. The Congress can vote in 2/3 majority to override the presidential veto. It's very hard to do that because each branch is very partisan, but this can be done if they want to circumvent the president's power. They also have the role of confirming the Supreme Court. So this gives a check on the executive as well as the judicial branch, because the executive branch nominates, but the Supreme Court has to be, or the justice has to be confirmed by the Senate. So they have to have kind of majority of people from both parties to confirm a justice. So that in order for a justice to become on the Supreme Court, they have to go through the executive branch and the judicial branch, or the legislative branch. So this is going to be very important, kind of a check on the judicial as well as the executive. So make sure the executive nominates qualified judges. And then the Supreme Court, they are in charge of confirming them. So they have the final say whether or not that justice would be on the court or not. Lastly, we'll look at the judicial branch check. A judicial branch can check the power of the other two branches in two ways. They can declare a law passed by Congress unconstitutional. This would make the law invalid, and they can't do that. So that's kind of a big role of the Supreme Court. Same with they can declare presidential action unconstitutional. So the president can do executive orders, and if the court finds these executive orders to be unconstitutional, they can reverse them. So this is kind of the two big checks that the judicial branch has on the other branches of government. Judicial review is this kind of theory that the power of the court to review a law for constitutionality and strike down that law if it believes the law is unconstitutional. So we'll see if they kind of take cases, and in order for the Supreme Court to hear a case, there has to be some sort of damages occurred. So if a law could be passed and it could be unconstitutional, but if nobody's hurt by it, it might not ever get to the Supreme Court. So there has to be someone who has some sort of damage by a law in order for it to get heard by the Supreme Court. So that's kind of how their process works. So there are two checks on the Congress and president is that they can deem their law or their action unconstitutional, and therefore it will be reversed. Judicial review was established in the courts by Marbury versus Madison. This basically decided that it gave the power to the Supreme Court that they can declare laws or actions unconstitutional. So it kind of gives them the power to reverse a legislative decision. So this is going to be a big deal and a big power given to the judicial branch based on this review, because now they actually have power to do stuff. The founders didn't necessarily say this in the Constitution, but it was decided by the court in 1803 and kind of has stood since, that they get the kind of the ability to decide whether or not a law is constitutional or not. So we see this as being their main source of power. Okay, so that's where we're going to end today. You should have taken notes as we went along. If you had to pause it, I kind of went through things rather quickly. So if you want to pause it, take your notes and kind of go forward and play it when you're ready, that would be awesome. In class tomorrow, we'll talk about an assignment we're going to be doing. But today, we're just taking some notes. So make sure you get these down and have a great rest of your day.